So, good evening, everybody, and a warm welcome to you all. My name is Professor Mark Searcy. I'm the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Science for the University of East Anglia. Tonight is the first of UEA's newly rebranded Lasdun Lectures. They were formerly called the London Lectures. And this is our first in-person event in this series for 21 months. Isn't it fantastic to be here again in person? That's probably my only round of applause for tonight. And our first and as a way to jump back in, we've gathered a very special panel of some of our esteemed experts and are asking the question, what happened at COP26? Tonight's panel comprises Professor Corinne Le Quéré, Professor Heike Schroeder, and Asher Mins. Before we hear from them, I'd like to give you a brief update on recent happenings at UEA. Climate change touches everyone, and the university's Climate of Change campaign, a COP26 concurrent campaign, has engaged students, researchers, graduates, and young people through outreach activities with schools, as well as fantastic talks and an interactive stand at the Norwich Science Festival. COP26 has also shone a spotlight on Climate UEA's important work, including Professor Le Quéré's input into the global carbon budget and Professor Schroeder's work into the ways Indigenous communities are helping us tackle climate change. Asher Mins ran 12 days of public engagement activities for all UK universities researching climate change. We should be thankful that he's here tonight after that. It's highlighted the many ways the UEA community, that's staff, students and graduates, have been helping tackle the crisis, as well as reaffirming UEA's own net zero commitments. Can we be sure if COP26 was a success? Well, we might find out a little bit more about that tonight, but it also depends on who you are. What is sure, and what I can be certain of, is this: UEA's role in positively influencing the climate debate over the past 40 years, informing the decision makers with reliable pioneering science and raising the profile of the climate emergency. This brings us on to the introduction to our panel for this evening. Professor Corinne Le Quéré is a Royal Society Research Professor of Climate Change Science at the University of East Anglia. She is Chair of France's High Council on Climate and a member of the UK Climate Change Committee. Previously, she directed the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research and instigated the annual publication of the Global Carbon Budget as part of the Global Carbon Project, directing the update for 13 years. Corinne was also author of the 3rd, 4th and 5th assessment reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. Most recently, she was awarded the Dr. A.H. Heineken Prize for Environmental Sciences in 2020. Professor Schroeder is Professor of Environmental Governance at the School of International Development here at UEA. She is Principal Investigator of the Indigenous International Interactions for Sustainable Development Project, a member of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research, and a lead faculty member of the Earth System Governance Project. Heike was a Senior Fellow at the Institute for Advanced the Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam in 2019. Previously, she was a Tyndall Senior Research Fellow and an Oxford Martin Senior Fellow at the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford, and a researcher at the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at the University of California, Santa Barbara, as well as the executive officer of a 10-year international research project on the institutional dimensions of global environmental change, a core project of the International Human Dimensions Programme on Global Environmental Change. They have quite long titles, these things. Last but by no means least, Asher Mins is a radar engineer which I didn't realize, who is specialized in science communication and knowledge transfer of climate change research to audiences that are outside of academia. He has 20 years of experience of environmental science communication and consultancy. Asher is interdisciplinary with a humanities master's in science communication and a BSc in environmental biology, as well as being a qualified engineer. His science communication career has spanned Imperial College, Oxford, Imperial College, Oxford University, Future Earth, and the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research. Now that we've heard about our panel, please join me in giving them a warm welcome to our event this evening. And I'm going to hand over to Corinne.
Thank you very much, Mark. Good evening, everybody. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here, actually super excited. I did give a Lasdun lecture in London some years ago, and it's really nice to have an audience in person. So before I start, who here thinks that the Glasgow meeting, COP meeting, was a success? Raise your hand if you think it was a success. Okay, a few hands. Who thinks it was a failure? Raise your hand if you think it was a failure. More think it was a failure. There's some kind of timid hands. I suppose the rest you're waiting to hear from tonight's event to make up your mind. Let me just first, I have 10 minutes here. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the Glasgow Pact itself. So what's in the pact, maybe say a little bit of what my opinion is. And then I'll spend a few slides to say what is it that we actually do, people like me and people that work in this university when there's an event like this. But first about the Glasgow Pact. So the outcome of this 2 week in Glasgow is a very insignificant piece of document. You see it, the official document is in the middle here. It's 10 pages of essentially words. I mean, yeah, just like text. And when you read it the first time, you think, oh, actually, maybe it's not, it doesn't look very impressive, I have to say. In comparison, you look at the IPCC report, which is here. So the state of climate science is 2,000 pages, lots of figures, you see it, and it has the weight of science behind it. It's very, very impressive. But actually, I have to say that the Glasgow Climate Pact is pretty clever. It brings together so many different stands. For me, as a climate scientist, it delivered a lot more than I expected from this conference. And here's why. The first point is that this conference was the first challenge of the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement on climate change is the international treaty on climate change. It was agreed in 2015, and it had a bunch of words in it, 27 pages of words. But one of the things that it realized is that we have an ambition to tackle climate change. It is to limit warming well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to 1.5 degrees. On the other hand, you ask all the countries, what are they prepared to do? And you're at 3 degrees. And the diplomats, are there any diplomats in this room here? Diplomats are very clever. They're really good. British diplomats, French diplomats, they particularly stand out. They realized this and they said, okay, we'll do it anyway. Let's do the Paris Agreement anyway, but we will invite countries in 5 years to strengthen their agreements, and that was Glasgow. So countries came back in Glasgow and strengthened their agreements. They strengthened their agreements. They agreed on the rule book, so they decided on the rules so that there's no double counting and everybody knows what they're doing. And the Paris Agreement works. It's based on strong science foundations. There's a lot more mention of science in the Glasgow Pact than there was in the Paris Agreement, which is great. It means that they're really following the science in this agreement. So there's all the official agreements which are in the Pact and are in the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, where the countries submit officially their commitments. So there is a little subtlety here you have to understand about Glasgow. It is that, on the one hand, countries came with official commitments to the United Nations. On the other hand, the presidents and prime minister came behind the podium and did promises. And those promises are a lot lighter than the official commitments to the United Nations, but they kind of give you quite a flavor of what leaders are thinking of, what they have to do. And one of the set of promises is those pledges about net zero. Pledges about net zero. You need to bring the emissions down to net zero, absolute zero if you can, where you can, offset with carbon sinks where you can. You absolutely need to do that. And many, many world leaders came, over 130 countries, including China, including India, came and said, we will reach net zero sometime in the future. Yes, too late probably, but they said it. That means that this information is sinking in their heads, and maybe when they come back in 5 years, they have a plan. So excellent pledges to net zero. Also sectoral deals, which were not in the Glasgow, they're not part of the official route to Glasgow or in the pact itself, but they did allow actors, cities, businesses, and so on to come and actually be part of the commitment action. The actual commitments themselves, so the ones that are solid, they're too weak. The 2030 commitments are too weak. Countries push their actions after this decade, which is the decade where we need to act. But they have agreed, and this is where the diplomats come again into place. They have seen that it's not going to be enough, and they have agreed to come back, not in 5 years, but next year already, and that's another bit of information that is actually really precious in this otherwise 10-page document of words. Words are important. I want to now move to what we've actually done in this university, and we actually do a lot of the science. Mark said that. These are some of the people that have been involved in IPCC report. I want to praise the work of Jordan Harold in particular, PhD student. His work with the IPCC summary for policymakers has actually transformed the way that climate information is presented so that it is understandable. I really strongly recommend to have a look at this summary for policymakers. What I've done in Glasgow is I had two tasks. The first one, Mark mentioned that I chair the French High Council on Climate. I sit on the UK Climate Change Committee. These committees are independent, grounded in science, evidence-based committee. They look at socio-economic implications. They engage with stakeholders, and they essentially are there to keep governments accountable. And in the UK, I think the UK Climate Change Committee has demonstrated that it works, it helps, it adds to the dynamics of climate policy in the UK, and it's been recognized internationally, so that there's more than 20 such committees worldwide. We've done a briefing on this ahead of COP, actually, to inform this system, this process. And at COP, we launched the International Climate Councils Network, bringing all these committees together to try and help each other, learn the insight from each other, and more importantly, to try and promote evidence-based, science-based action at the country level and make action go faster. The second thing that I did is launch the Global Carbon Budget 2021. So as part of my research, I keep track of the emissions of CO2 and their partitioning in the environment, land, ocean, and atmosphere. And you remember we had this COVID crisis recently where there was confinement measures before we could meet again in person, which led to a 5% decrease in CO2 emissions, which you see just right here, 5% decrease in CO2 emissions as 2020. I could talk a long time on this, but I won't. But just to say that this year, the emissions have rebounded. Of course, they have rebounded. The decrease in emissions was about, locking people up in their houses, but the rebound is not as high, it's still below 2019. The rebound is actually putting countries back on their trajectory pre-COVID, like if nothing has happened. It's not, we haven't had a green recovery. We have had a normal recovery in today's economy, and we're back on the trajectories. Countries where emissions went up, they are going up now. Countries where emissions went down, they're going down now. So it's all, but behind this, there is progress. There is 15 countries today where emissions decrease systematically while the GDP grows or the economic wealth grows, whichever metrics you want to look at. There is decarbonization of energy in China, for example, which is really tough. But it's all too slow. That's the problem. It's all too slow. This is the critical climate change decade. Action needs to start now. And that's why this meeting next year, 2022, will be extremely important. And that's when we'll know if COP this year has succeeded or failed. A lot of people are involved in this. I want to just praise particularly Matt Jones, who does really a lion's share of the work, lots of graphs, lots of visual material, and Dorothee Bakker, who's responsible for the ocean observations, is really tough. Last thing that I did at COP, that we do a lot in this university, and this is really a special aspect of the UEA, is that we do a lot of transfer of knowledge. We talk a lot to people outside of science. Through the Royal Society, a lot of people have worked in briefing for COP. We've worked on Science Brief to produce all these briefings here ahead of COP, and a lot of interviews with journalists, which is absolutely great, but I really need a holiday now. So I'll leave, Heike is you now. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to start with a bit of a spoiler alert. We've just had good cop, Corin, present. I'm going to take a little bit more of a role of the bad cop when I talk about what happened at COP26. So I'll talk about the Glasgow Climate Pact and think about what climate of change does it represent, borrowing from the title of this event. So the Glasgow Climate Pact, we've already heard a bit from Corin about it. Basically, here are some of the maybe kind of spinned headlines about it. It finalizes the Paris Agreement. And so the Paris Rulebook that's been negotiating over the last 5 years, or not last year. There were still 3 main issues that were outstanding, and it's quite impressive that actually agreement has been reached. So the 3 were on loss and damage, to compensate developing countries that are experiencing actual loss and damage from climate change, as well as the carbon market, Article 6, that was still outstanding. And then the third one was about transparency framework. So that's good news. The Paris Agreement is now absolutely finalized and implementable. Then there is another spin that I read in the newspapers about Glasgow, which is it keeps the 1.5 degrees Celsius target alive. So we've heard from Corin that we still have a lot to do. We're at 2.4 degrees. If the current NDCs, nationally determined contributions, are to actually be implemented in the way that they're promised, we would still be on a 2.4 degrees trajectory. But that means that we might still be able to ratchet up and accelerate our efforts in the very, very near future, as in next year. And then there is a new word that has emerged that after all these decades, finally we have an agreement in an actual formal document, which is a reference to coal, which of course is one of the big accelerators of climate change. So the final wording was that we agreed to phase down unabated coal power. And then also somewhere else it says to reduce inefficient coal subsidies. So this did get watered down in the final days. It was first to be phased out, but now we're phasing down. And we're not reducing coal subsidies as such, only inefficient subsidies. But hey, we're making progress. The Glasgow Climate Pact is focused on 4 different areas, and they include mitigation, adaptation and finance. That's also the 3 pillars of the Paris Agreement. But then it's also focusing on collaboration. I think that's actually a very good move because a lot of the actual work so often happens in between and in kind of more voluntary efforts. And Corin has talked a bit about those as well. So in terms of mitigation, what's really central here is the move to formulating mid-century net zero pledges. A lot of countries are joining this effort. We've got new nationally determined contributions from 153 countries. That's not all countries. Here's my bad cop. But still, and these came in especially in the last few months, and also from countries where we'd been waiting to hear. We now have heard, like China, India, I think were later ones. Adaptation, one interesting aspect here that I noticed was a commitment to doubling 2019 levels of adaptation finance by 2025. We'll see what happens. In terms of finance, there's a move toward formulating a new post-2025 climate finance goal, so we shall watch the space. In terms of collaboration, there's a lot of new collaborations between governments, businesses, civil society in order to deliver climate goals faster. And that's kind of the crucial order of the day. How can we accelerate our efforts? So here I am standing a couple of weeks later, having had a lot of good reporting in a way, actually, from the news, having been a little bit unsure of what to make of what was going on whilst I was in Glasgow myself. I just sit here and wonder and compare back to moments in history, especially Paris and Kyoto. And they were certainly moments of euphoria. So it did seem like a lot was achieved in those two conferences in particular. So let me now stock take a little bit on the commitments to date. So we have been seeing negotiations now for 31 years. If I start from the inception point of the negotiations toward the UNFCCC, it started in 1990. So we've had the commitments of the 1992 UNFCCC, which included a non-binding stabilization target for Annex 1, which means developed countries. And the stabilization was to be reached by 2000 of 1990 levels. Unfortunately, only 2 countries achieved this, and not because they were so ambitious with their climate efforts, but just because of history. You might know, well, Germany saw the collapse of East German industries because of the fall of the Berlin Wall. That saved a lot of dirty emissions, and then the UK Thatcher's policy moving from coal to gas actually also decreased emissions there. 1997, the Kyoto Protocol targets, there was an agreement to collectively then reduce emissions by 5.2%. That was not met. Some countries did better than others, and also some countries had easier targets than others. There was a lot of hot air kind of included in a lot of countries, making it quite easy and harder than for others as well. 2009, we had the Copenhagen Accords with a promise of 100 billion of finance for developing countries by 2020, 100 billion per year, I mean. That has not yet been met, but there's a projection that we'll get there by 2023. So again, watch this space. And then the Paris Agreement's NDCs, again, as we've heard already, current updates are still keeping us on a 2.4 warming trajectory. So far I would summarize by saying the track record has been one of empty promises. However, of course, when we look back to the conversations we had decades ago, we are moving forward. Unfortunately, we're moving forward incredibly slowly. So considering the approach to date, so what approach has climate policy taken? The framing of climate change has been very much one of a technical problem that can be solved with more knowledge, just more know-how, expertise, research, and management. When we look at technology, actually, we do have a lot of really useful technology available already. It just needs to be implemented and used properly. In terms of politics, we've seen decades of ongoing bargaining, finger-pointing, compromises, rhetorics, and spins. In terms of behavioral change, there's been very much of a focus on changing people top-down. So in a way, I would argue that it's been quite a surface-level approach so far, and this could be kind of illustrated by the iceberg, in that we just kind of try and move the iceberg from the top, but without really taking advantage of the leverage of deeper layers, to which I want to come to next. So we can say then, maybe in other words, that we might still be trying to solve the problem with the same mindset that created it, borrowing from Einstein. And here I really refer to the mindset of competition, comparison, compartmentalization, separation, and also very long, arduous negotiations with to be honest, little real progress over the decades. And that is not to say that the people involved don't work hard. They work extremely hard. They sleep very few hours during these 2 weeks of negotiations. So it's not down to lack of effort on the part of the individual at all. So what are we missing? Are we missing an important trick here? And again, this is very much also then open for discussion afterwards. And I look forward to your responses. So firstly, can we move, this is one thought, maybe a little bit ill-formulated for now, but can we move from an interacting to an intra-acting or being, in terms of, can we move from a global system of separate states to one where we recognize that we are all on one planet together? So shifting that mindset. Second, can we go beyond kind of linear thinking of top-down and bottom-up to somewhere where maybe we recognize a fractal approach where the unexpected can happen through doing things differently? And then thirdly, can we move from humans as the problem to humans as the solution and focus so much more on our togetherness, our holism, doing less, being more, so that we can actually bring ourselves as individuals, as humans, much more into the equation of this process that is very much dominated by industry, by political process, by negotiations, where negotiators represent vested interests rather than humanity at large. I'll end here, and I look forward to discussions later. Thank you very much, and hand over to Asha.
There's me. I only bought this so I can sort of rustle and lose my space and things like that. So just following our esteemed leader. Well, thank you very much, Mark, for the introduction. So I'm not doing something differently, but we've heard really good sort of technical input about what happened at COP and some of the activities that UEA does at COP. I'm sort of the public engagement person, so I tend to look at it from how the public perceive COP, how climate change, and so this is something that I've been working at for many years. And I guess I have been attending. Well, my first COP was in 2000. So I'm going to tell you a story really about COPs and my experience of COPs. And this year was in particular because COP was in the UK. There has actually been 25 other COPs, but you'd have thought the media wouldn't know that. So it became a much bigger UK media story as you'd might expect. And that's exactly what you can see here. So the timeline of mentions of climate change and global warming in the press, number of articles over time. And you can, so just look at the black spotty line, and you can see that they're all, so that's the UK newspapers. We can do this for lots of other places as well, places in the world. But you can see all the spikes, and the spikes are COPs. So COPs are when it is mostly that the media gathers together to really concentrate on the climate change story. We can explain all the little ups and downs, but I won't do that to you right now. The takeaway is more news reporting in the UK of climate change and global warming than there's ever been before, but it always spikes with COPs. But what does this do? So if we assume that the media doesn't, from media theory, it doesn't tell us what to think, it tells us what to think about. And so, well, what does all those spikes and all those up and downs do to public perception of climate change, people thinking about climate change? So here we are, climate change concern, more recently from 16 to, it finishes in October 21. These are clearly the developed countries, industrialized countries. And you can see a rise, you can see a dip here and there, and again, you can explain most of the ups and downs. So if you're looking at 2018, that's when for the UK, or actually more from the UK, Greta Thunberg, that's when the school strike sort of went international. So there's definitely a rise in attention there. For the UK also, it's when Extinction Rebellion got out onto the streets as well. So you absolutely do see a rise. But then you can look at Canada and Australia for wildfires, Germany for the floods, that sort of thing. So you can explain all these ups and downs, but overall, an increase, a decrease, and then it comes up again. But then, well, what about now? So that ended in October. Now, this survey, Ipsos Mori, was done in the second week of Glasgow. So it's the second week. I can't even remember what the dates were now. 13th of November is when it finished. So it was the second dates, and you can see here. So it's jumped up 16 points from the previous October poll. Most people now have climate, environment, pollution higher than COVID. So COVID is second at that little moment in time. These surveys are fallible as well. They're not perfect. Even during COVID, climate and environment actually came second. In that lockdown, it was still there as a major issue of public concern. And there's a load of stuff under this data, but I'll just try and give you some of the highlights. So using this same data set of the week before last, 3/5 of people, this is all UK people, think that developing countries, including the UK, should pay more to solve the climate emergency. There is broad support about the COP26 goals to protect and restore forests and nature, invest in renewables, adapt to climate impacts. Fewer people actually supported switching to electric vehicles. 7 in 10, 70% say they feel confident that they personally will be able to take actions to help combat climate change in the next few years. And those people, that 70%, was mostly women and those in higher income households, although actually that was only by a few percent points for lower income households, but it just tips slightly over to higher income households. And 3/4 of the public think that the UK government should do more. So this is what the public think. This is polls. And my takeaway from that, and my takeaway for the last 2 decades of doing this stuff, is politicians, civil servants, marketers, businesses, campaigners, universities completely underestimate the public interest and engagement in climate and environment. They think it's something other, it's a difficult thing, but actually the public are with it. And I could go back polls over years and years and years and sort of give you the same sorts of data. But now is the peak, and it's peak because it's been in the media. So coming a bit more sort of from looking externally at COPs to looking a bit more internally at COPs. Well, who goes to COPs? So this was the biggest COP. 40,000 people went to Glasgow. That's more than ever before, which you can see in the red line. That's Glasgow. And again, you can see, just like you see in the media data and the public data, if I did it a bit longer over time, you can see how countries around the world, representatives of different countries, have actually got more interested in COPs and climate change. Basically, up to COP15, Copenhagen, nobody turned up. Really, it was really marginal. Whatever, Whereas the whole world went to Copenhagen, dropped off a bit. Paris just rebooted the whole thing, and since then, it's gone up and up and up, and Glasgow again. So the fact that the public, the media, and the politicians, the civil servants, the NGO observers, the charities, and everybody are now on this is remarkable, because when I started out, nobody was interested, really. It was very, very few people who were really paying attention to this. A little bit about what we did in Glasgow. Mark mentioned it. So I ran a showcase of all UK universities to do public engagement. I've just been on about how I really try to see things from the public and engage the public in climate change. That's what I do. That's sort of like my professional mission. And I won't go through this, but these are some of the things that we had in there. We had poetry anthologies. We had books about biofuels, which are actually more interesting than it sounds. We had museums of the fossil age, which was looking back from the future on the artifacts now that are made of oil and are carbon intensive. But overall, we had 50 different research centres and research groups in that time. And I'm just putting this one here. This suit is now more famous than I am. This is, which actually doesn't take much, but this is me in public engagement mode. And this, just for like that nanosecond, hashtag COP26, a weatherman took a picture of me, and so you know how Twitter and social media, and it all whizzed out all over and then gone in a nanosecond. But this isn't about me. This is about Helen Adams, the woman I'm speaking to there. She's a alumni Tyndall Centre UEA PhD. She was head of science engagement at COP. And that's just brilliant. You know, I'm so proud to have worked with people like that they come from working with us through to sorting out the whole world and all the science that was going on in COP26. So that's about her, not about me. We're going to talk about 3 COPs in particular. So this one is Copenhagen, 2009. That's that first spike you see when I said the whole world came together. It was a mess. It failed, and that's one of the reasons that I think Glasgow was good, because actually it wasn't Copenhagen. When you've got the low benchmark to set things against, then that absolutely was it. And for people, hands up if you know what ClimateGate is. Everybody, okay. Who saw the drama, the BBC drama? Okay, quite a lot of people. Okay, so in that case, I'm not going to explain what it was about. But I'm still not paid enough as the man who was there at Copenhagen, the grumpiest climate conference ever, with the University of East Anglia over his head for 2 weeks on his exhibition stand, with a lot of miserable people wanting to blame somebody about why everything was failing. That was nothing to do with UEA or the hacking. It was diplomacy and other things as the reason that all failed. Whizzing through to Paris, so one of the things I want to just talk about, and Corinne spoke a little bit, the convening power that UEA and the Tyndall Centre, with our friends around the world, have on bringing the media to science. So this is one of our press conferences where the UN security had to stop journalists and camera crews from getting in. So that's definitely an impact that we do about communicating the science, helping get those messages out there. And one of the successes of Paris was, as Heike was saying, it went from less top-down to much more participatory, where countries started pledging and rather than being sort of ruled top-down. And that's one of the changes that we've seen over COPs, and that's partly why they've become countries have become more involved and more engaged. And as Corinne said, that was the science-based COP. That's when the science started getting into the texts, and that's even more so now in Glasgow. It's more in the text. And again, as somebody who's a science communicator, whose job it is to help take the science and get it to the people that need to do it, then that's brilliant. And the track record of UEA in all the IPCC reports is really testament to how important that's gone. Because before Paris, there wasn't much talk of the science. I was alone often as one of the few universities who was actually taking part in the COP process, but then it all came after Copenhagen. A completely separate aside is the experiment we all took part in by going to COP. 40,000 people, all vaccinated, all masks, flow testing every day. This is the Glasgow figures for cases. And there was 200 and something thousand tests a day in Glasgow because we were all flow testing. And you can see there's a slight raise, but that's not a COVID outbreak. That's not a pandemic. So this is a different science story, but I just wanted to say that that was going on as well. And that's a good story, because it could have ended up even worse. That's what I look like on a Sunday morning when I'm doing BBC World, when I thought I was going to be doing BBC World Service. I'll just put that in there. So do read your texts properly when the BBC asks you to do something. I had to rush and put a jacket on, just so I sort of looked a bit professional. And yeah, we started actually with sort of good cop, bad cop. So I'll just say, well, has anybody changed their mind between, if you change your mind from good cop to bad cop, if Hiker prevailed, hand up. No? Anybody gone the other way, bad cop to good cop? Some people have gone the other way, and people just stayed the same. Okay, yeah, so most people kind of stay the same. Well, one of the reasons that I flashed that picture up actually was because I was trying to resist that question from the BBC. There was so much, was it a good cop, was it a bad cop? Don't know, it's only for the first Friday. And apart from making a sort of bad media pun that only works in the English language, as far as I'm concerned, you can only really judge a cop from the future. You can't judge a cop from now. It's what happened in the end. And for that, I suggest you read The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson, which is a really powerful book all about climate change, and it's a novel. And we've talked a lot about science. Of course we have. There's so much of culture in climate and changing public perceptions about climate change and how people think about climate change as well. So I don't think we should deny culture either. So that would be probably my first takeaway. And my second takeaway really is, whether the public is poised for leadership. They're hungry for leadership. All those people, 3/4 of people think the government should do more. 70% of people want to do more. And so whether you're undergraduate, postgraduate, alumni, professional staff, emeritus professor, these are the people who can take that leadership and help take people forwards in where we want to be with understanding climate change and feeling empowered and have the action to respond to climate change. With that, I finish, and cheers, which is my Glasgow cheers.
So thank you to all our speakers. I have to say it took me a few minutes. I'm embarrassed about the fact that it took me a few minutes to get Hiker's joke about good cop and bad cop. It also worried me a little bit that not only about Asher's suit earlier on, but I don't know whether you noticed the shirt in the last slide. I'm not sure what his excuse for the shirt was in the last one. And also for 20,000 pieces of plastic for lateral flow tests for COP, which is from an environmental point of view is not very good. But I just wanted to, before we start with the panel, I just wanted to say, as the Pro Vice Chancellor for Science at UEA, I have to say that this is one of those things, we talk about impact all of the time within science, and this is one of the demonstrations that you have of the science and the research that we do at UEA and at other universities has an immense impact. And this is really one of the areas that I'm immensely proud of the work that we do at UEA that contributes to things like COP. And it is a fantastic demonstration of the way that the things we do at the university go out into the world and have an impact. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask our three speakers to join me at the front, and have we're going to have a panel session, which I'm moderating, which actually means I'm going to sit at the end and not really say very much. And there are, I think we have microphones going around. So if you have any questions for our panel, please do raise your hand, and we'll get a microphone to you so that the people on the streaming can actually hear what you're saying. So I think we have somebody just here. There's a microphone just there.
It's just coming. Here we go.
I was pleased to hear about this meeting because it gives me an opportunity to come and hear from frontliners what's been going on. Because as the meeting progressed, I was showing some concern, so I'm probably in the bad cop group at the moment. I have some comments or questions about the organisation of the meeting, but I'd leave that out of it and perhaps we can pick that up later. But one of the points that did arise during the meeting was arising from Paris, the promises of $100 billion to cater for the problems arising in countries affected by it. And as I understood it, there had been no requests for any money coming in from the countries, even from the gentleman who gave a briefing standing up to his waist nearly in water. Now, there's been effects already with 1 degree of climate change. Why hasn't there been any requests coming in from these developing countries to ask for money to help them through the immediate period? Because it's going to get worse as we go up to 1.5 degree. And so I would encourage those countries to come forward with costed proposals for what they want for their particular countries, whether it's sorting out the land, raising their huts, or digging wells in the middle of Africa, which is where I've worked recently. So there's that side of it. The other thing is that as a result of climate change, there is likely to be a new bunch of people, a large number of people who require places to live in. Their island has been submerged or some other reason. And so this is another group of asylum seekers. So could I suggest that the UK, as well as encouraging countries to come forward with costed proposals, work on the UN to get a new class of asylum seeker, climate asylum seekers? Thank you.
Thank you. So we got two. Okay. We got two questions. One about why do you think countries haven't come forward to ask for funding yet?
Yeah, I mean, I can have a go at this. I mean, I don't know why they haven't, but you're absolutely right that we now need to go into the specifics. So who needs what, how much? And that's one of the big issues of adaptation and resilience. If you think about it, for reducing emission, we have targets. We know what net zero looks like. We have carbon budget. We have really quite tangible metrics. But when you talk about adaptation, it's really difficult because one, it's a moving target because the climate changes all the time. Two, you don't know what part of the change in climate is climate change and what part is natural variability. So you're never quite completely sure what you have to adapt. Importantly, we haven't done the hard bit of quantifying, putting numbers behind adaptation and making these metrics very specific to countries, prioritizing what they need, when, and who should pay, which is actually the end bit that we're talking about, but we're not talking about, or at least a lot less, about the rest of it.
Can I respond to that immediately? Because this is an immediate problem that these people are facing in these countries. And they, by putting money, by requesting money, and by asking for how $100 billion can be distributed amongst developing countries who are going to be suffering and are suffering now, focuses the mind of the countries that are doing most of the pollution at the moment. So I think it's something that they ought to do now, even as a desk exercise, and get it on the table so that it's there for discussion at the next meeting. Thank you.
I think that is, Heike knows quite a lot about this as well, but that is playing out. So there's a huge discussion been going on for years about loss and damage. And actually that's one of the reasons, which is compensation, really, is compensation for loss and damage. And that's one of the many reasons why the poor countries are even more peeved off than they were last time round, because there is never, it's always been discussed, loss and damage is in there, but there's no money forthcoming. And the same for climate finance, like Heike was saying, and Corinne, the 100 billion. I think was that Copenhagen? The Copenhagen. So
Yeah,
2009, they agreed to 100 billion a year. That isn't 100 billion yet. And I mean, I remember 3 presidents ago, Barack Obama was talking about it a lot, along with John Kerry, who are here now. So I think the finance aspect, for right or for wrong, it's just it is, and it's there, and it's really important. And for some poor countries, you know, including China, including India. You know, India got vilified slightly for changing the wording on coal. But actually, if nobody's forthcoming with money, and I want to increase my GDP, my economy, I know I'm going to be energy hungry, I might not necessarily agree with their perspective, but I can see where they're coming from. You spoke yourself about historical emissions. So there is a lot of discussion about money, and I think probably until money actually is made real in a meaningful way, a lot of progress will not be made, because a lot of the poor countries are basically holding their nose and agreeing to the Glasgow Accord, even though they actually get nothing from it. There's nothing in it from them.
That's my point. That you want something on the table that focuses the mind of the people who've promised this $100 billion.
Yeah, and that's for climate finance in particular, not for loss and damage. But yeah.
Turn the question round the other way, and people who disagree with it, let them demonstrate that it's not due to climate change that the water level has come up and flooded out their houses.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you don't have to go to poor countries to see that. You can go to the Norfolk coast to see exactly the same thing.
Okay, thank you for those points. We've got another question just here.
Yes, if I can. Thank you very much for a really fabulous presentation. Thoroughly enjoyed that. I want to build on slightly on the point that the gentleman has been making already. Last night I was very fortunate to watch a private viewing of a film called The Great Green Wall. I don't know whether you've heard about it, but it's a project to green the Sahara Desert, or the Sub-Sahara, from the Atlantic coast to I guess it's the Indian Ocean. What was interesting, it was done by a Malinese, a female singer. She was absolutely wonderful, and I'm sure it'll get some media. But what was really striking and frightening was the fact that the biggest impediment to all of this was primarily Boko Haram. And it's to take the climate change issue away from all the other sustainable development goals, women's rights and all of those other things. And what they were doing, sadly, is that they were using this climate crisis. This gentleman has just given an example of islands. A lot of the male and organisations like Boko Haram were getting in on the back of that and using it as an opportunity to promote their own views. So my question really is, to what extent can we take all the things that you've been talking about and put them separate to the other sustainable development goals? It seems that we have to move everything forward all at once, and I'd quite like your opinion on that.
Okay, yeah. So I didn't hear the last few words you said. You're quite...
I'd love to hear your opinion on how we bring all these issues, which are very, very pressing and interconnected.
Absolutely. So I work on the local level quite a lot, and as you've mentioned, in indigenous communities. And what's really important to recognize is that climate change is kind of a global Western agenda, more so than that it really addresses the needs on the ground. However, interestingly, oftentimes it still represents them, even though the needs will be formulated in a different way. So for example, we work in Bolivia, and the river there in the community has dried up. So they don't have access to fish as part of their diet anymore. So they wouldn't really talk about climate change and emissions, but they do see the changes on the ground, and they formulate and they conceptualize that in their own kind of day-to-day living as something where their diet is changing. So to engage them at that level is actually a lot more effective, because that's what's visible also to people on the ground. And there's different examples of what's changing, and that's different actually depending on where you look. So at the end of the day, we have a very large, maybe patchwork or kaleidoscope of issues that are, really in our faces that we must address. One of which is climate change. And also, a lot of these various issues that you can point out independently actually also interconnected. So food is interconnected with energy, is interconnected with climate change. So it could be that it really depends on who you speak with and where you are engaging, which of these would be the ones much more front and center than any of the others that are still interconnected. So it's really, I think, about diversifying the engagements that we have and working, let's say, on the ground so much more with the immediate issues that people are faced with. Whereas at the international level, it's very much one of facilitating kind of maybe an understanding of the interactions and interdependencies between these different challenges that we're facing, mobilizing money in a way that actually gets to the people that need them, and to just kind of maybe go back to what the first gentleman was asking. There has been a stalemate on this topic of finance, as the developing world obviously are faced with a lot of loss and damage as a result. And the developed world is a little hesitant to just grant that without knowing how this money would be spent. But the developing world does not want to necessarily commit to spending it in the way that it's prescribed. So they want it and do whatever they want with it. So there's these kinds of challenges that have just not been resolved over now 10 years plus. And more. I mean, finance has always been on the table, but it's definitely become more politicized in more recent years.
Can I add a bit on that, actually, because it's really a super important question, and actually a lot of people raise it. And fundamentally, I completely agree that sustainability is a lot more than climate change, and it's actually really essential that we become completely sustainable. We recycle everything, and we live within the planetary boundaries. And I think it's going to happen, probably not in my lifetime, but I think it's going to happen. But my experience has been that if you englobe climate change into many different issues, it becomes complicated. And what happens with a complicated problem practically is that policymakers or decision makers will hold on to the easiest, the path of least resistance, typically focus on recycling or waste, which is, in terms of climate change, tiny. But it gives, if there's too many options, it gives the option to do something that is insignificant, giving you the feeling that you've actually done something meaningful. And we have to cut down our emissions to net zero. It's a tough problem, and we have to do this. And my perspective now is that we start with this. We'll build these international relationships. I mean, what happened in Glasgow was incredible, with all these policymakers at the same table discussing about a huge, fantastically huge problem. If we can crack this, then we can move on to the next problem afterward with, the same framework.
Somebody at the back there.
Hello, I've got a question from our online audience. What do you think of Clima DAO, a carbon-backed currency that has reached a $1 billion market cap since launching in October 2018, along with 11.5 million tons of CO2 offsets?
I'm unaware of it. I've not heard of it.
Thanks for giving us some homework.
Sounds like a lot of money. Actually, I have not heard of it. I must look it up.
Don't know.
We have a set of blank faces.
Yes, we'll do our homework next time.
There was somebody in the middle, actually, who had their hand up there. Just in the, towards the back there.
Yeah.
So I've got two questions. One of them is, why do we think that the majority of people are women that seem to care about this more? And the second one is more of like a local thing. So what are UEA actually doing to offset our own carbon footprint? Because I don't think as students or even staff we're told much, and it's not shared what we're doing to improve our own, you know, climate effect.
Do you want to say that, Asha?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll do the first. I'll do the second one first. I sit on the UEA Sustainability Board, which oversees sustainability things at UEA. It's just going through a bit of a change at the moment. With we've been promoted, so we report to the university executive now, and we've got a new chair because the old chair retired. We now have net zero pathway for UEA. I won't go into the analysis, that's going to bore everybody. It's really good because I did it and it's really clever. So we have net zero analysis, we have targets for UEA, and we follow kind of the UK Climate Change Act, so it gets updated every 5 years. We've done stakeholder workshops to get the expertise, including student body, on what it is that needs to happen over 5-year time slices. We've only done the first 5 years. So we're on the beginning of a major journey, because net zero is real and proper, and a lot of achieving net zero is nothing to do with what we could do on campus. It's to do with sort of global change and infrastructure change. But there's absolutely progress happening. The communication aspects of that, maybe that's something I need to look at actually, just to see, because I kind of live in my little research bubble and out into the wider world. So in terms of how the students are engaged with that, although there's the climate of change campaign going on at the moment, I'm less familiar with that. And just to add, sorry, I don't want to talk too much, I'm also the co-chair of the new Norwich Climate Change Commission, so that Norwich hasn't had a climate change commission before, whereby a lot of this thinking will be playing out, because this isn't just a campus that sort of exists on the edge of the ring road. We are citizens of Norwich from a pollution point of view, from a carbon dioxide point of view, from a sustainability point of view. We've got great ambassadors out there in the community that can make things happen, and vice versa. So I'm in partnership with the Norwich City Council for that, and so I'm quite hopeful that that will yield benefits for Norwich as well as the campus as well. And I think I've got the wrong qualification to talk about the gender question. So I'm going to put that to you guys.
I think it's for you. No, it's you go.
Well, so it's nothing I've researched. I can't speak to this question from that perspective. But I would just kind of make a comment. One of the questions I ended with, where maybe we could generalize and say that women tend to work more collaboratively, cooperatively, help each other, kind of have a view to, you know, getting on, working in teams and partnerships, and maybe being a bit more sensitive to issues that might be in the way. I'm generalizing here, yeah. But there might just be more of a tendency for care that addresses that.
Well, I have noticed that in the Fridays for Future, there are lots of girls, and the leaders are lots of girls. But I mean, from my perspective as a climate scientist, I mean, I've been surrounded by men all my life. So how refreshing is that? So I don't necessarily see that it's so many women and girls. Actually, in Glasgow, were a lot of men that are there. And I mean, it is interesting why the girls are the leaders now. I mean, that would deserve some attention. but I think there's actually quite a lot of men in, at least at the table in the background. I think it's rather a positive development that there are lots of women. I mean, actually we're 50% of the population, actually, so that would be good that there's 50% in the end. I do want to add something about, I mean, not the UEA precisely, but maybe jump on the question to make a broader point that because action needs to happen now, this is very much a decade of planning, not a decade, oh, what am I talking about, rubbish, very much a year of planning, a year and 2 years of planning. So we've seen at the UEA this movement towards net zero. We see it at the government. So the government just published, the UK government, its plan for reaching net zero, which is a plan to actually reach net zero, which is what's surprising about it, although the title announces it. But it actually, you know, there's a plan behind this. And I think any business, any sort of community system, Norwich, my household, we have made a plan for reaching net zero. So it's actually possible to think about what is it that you can do to reach net zero, either with your circle of influence or even with your family. And you don't have to stress about it and to think it has to happen this year, next year, or even this decade, because not everything is ready. But if you make a plan, you can actually, next time you take a substantial decision about your life, you can have it in your mind that, in fact, if you need to change your boiler, you will consider to have a heat pump instead, for example. So I would very much encourage you to influence, to use your circle of influence. I mean, the person who you ask at the university, yes, thanks for your question very much. And I encourage you to ask it again and to probe and to ask the people in power what are they doing to tackle climate change themselves. And that brings me maybe just a little tidbit for the question that came on the internet, although I don't know the currency, the word offsets was mentioned. So I do want to maybe say a little something about offsets. So offsets are essential. So if we want to reach net zero emissions, which we have to, we must, to stabilize the climate, then there are some emissions that we cannot bring to zero, absolute zero. I mean, there's the emissions from agriculture, not with today's technology for sure. Emissions from agriculture we can't bring to zero. There's emissions from aviation. And, you know, you can say, you know, maybe in some world you could say, well, we shut down aviation, but in this world where it's the reality, where people live all over the place, you need to live with aviation. And so even if you sort of manage the demand so that it doesn't grow infinitely, you still have to offset these emissions. And you can offset these emissions by planting trees. That's the easiest. But you do have to have a sustainable use of land. You have to build this. You have to have confidence if you buy offsets that you're not actually buying hot air and things are just moved around and not leading to actual net sinks of carbon somewhere. And so this requires planning. I mean, this is serious discussions that happen at COP and elsewhere. It requires sustainability framework. It requires tracking where your carbon sinks come from, where your stuff, when you buy material, wood, where all this come from. There's an enormous amount of work to do in that direction for reaching full sustainability and the use of biomass. But that work is slowly starting. I would say it's not ready yet. So if you buy offsets to do something luxurious, don't buy don't buy it to feel good about yourself. But if you can't bring something down to completely zero and you want to encourage the offsets market, I think that it's a good market to encourage. You have to do it wisely. You have to look at what you're doing, but do it as a last means and not as a first means to offset everything you do.
Right, thank you. Somebody over there?
Maybe I'll go next. Corinne already addressed it partly. It was about technology. And my question is about the analogy between the Kyoto Protocol and the Montreal Protocol. And the Montreal Protocol is often cited as the most successful international agreement on environmental protection. And the reason I think it's partly successful, or it was mostly successful, because the technology existed to replace the problem, which was CFCs. So my question is, do you think that, we first agree that technology is the solution to this problem as well? And I guess Corinne partly addressed it already, that it might not be quite there yet. But if it is, I mean, what does it take us to use the technology that we already have to get to the solution? Why does it take so long to get to that point?
Mm-hmm. Should I have a go at that? Sure. Yeah. So technology is a large part of the solution. But there's issues of access, there's issue of costs, there's issue of production chain. I mean, take, for example, electrification of transport. So we must electrify transportation, so cars need to become electric. There's no, you can reduce the emissions from transport by cycling and walking, by using public transport. Then you also need to electrify your public transport, and you need to electrify the vehicles, the individual vehicles. So the technology is there. So you say technology is there. It's been there for a long time, but it's not been accessible. It's been too expensive. Car manufacturers produce petrol and diesel cars. That's how they know. That's what they know what to do. If you change this, there's a lot of resistance to change this because there's a lot of people employed, and you change your work market. So there's a huge amount of inertia in transferring a technology from an old technology to a new technology. And normally when that happens, there's a very big attractor in the end. And in this case, some things have an attractor. I think that an electric car is a lot better for all kinds of reasons, air pollution, even sound driving and everything. But it's not quite enough to push it there down the market. And you can do a lot, but you have to have a framework from governments to make your new technology cheaper than your old technology. I mean, this is really critical, and that's why we talk about a carbon tax, because at the moment it's free to pollute. So it's free to pollute, then you don't pay for the externalities. And so you need to, at the same time, subsidize your new technology, harm your old technology to sort of basculate that market. You can't do everything with technology. So in the CCC analysis, the analysis of the Climate Change Committee, there's about, I think, 40% that you can do just with technology, essentially power station moving to wind farms, for example. There's about 40% that you need to have an interactions between behavior and technology, so changing to an electric car and buying electric heating are in that category. And there's only less than 20%, so about 20% or so, which is pure behavior. So that's essentially choosing what you eat to be less carbon intensive, maybe lowering the heating of your home and flying less. And this part of pie receives a lot of attention, but it's actually not the biggest part. The biggest part is the investments that you need to do. The government needs to do a bunch of investments to make it accessible, to make public transport accessible, to make electricity renewable, and individuals need to do a bunch of investments so that the things around us are low carbon.
Okay, thank you. We are actually, we're going to take one more question from the online, and then what I might do is I'm being told that we're running out of time, so and possibly that the wine's getting warm outside, and so perhaps we can have the rest of the questions you could ask people outside over a glass of wine. So shall we take the last one from online?
Yeah, could you please tell us a bit more about the 1.5 degree target? Is it really still alive? What do the scientists say? And do you think policymakers really believe it is still achievable?
Yeah, that's a question for me. It's, well, you know, I've been using just alive, but I think we'd have to both wake up and be lucky for limiting climate change to 1.5 degrees, sorry. Just to say that 1.5 degree is going to be crossed. So the IPCC says it very clearly, because the question is warming going to go above 1.5 degree or not? And if to stay at 1.5 degree, the emissions of carbon dioxide would need to be cut by 45% in 2030. and they are now like marginally going up at the moment. So you have to go from a curve that is going up, 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 to a curve that is about this steep going down. So unless we wake up next year in wherever we're going, Egypt, the COP is going, unless we wake up, this is going to be extremely difficult to do. However, and that's why the just comes in line here, however, in Copenhagen, there's a new agreement to cut down methane emissions. And methane emissions are actually, they pollute a lot, they create about a third of the warming so far, and the climate responds very quickly to that. So if we are indeed able to cut methane emissions, that would do a huge contribution. It doesn't do a huge contribution in the long term, but it would certainly do a huge contribution in the short term. And, things will have to change next year. So in order for 1.5 to really be sort of the limit, next year at the COP, the countries will have to come back to the table with 2030 targets that are a lot stronger and plans that are already in place to put them up. And you know, there I would look at the United States, Europe, and China in particular to see whether they will be prepared to do that kind of effort. China's coal emissions was going down before the COVID. The COVID has really, really messed up their trajectory there. So, but they have signed an agreement directly, a bilateral with the United States, which is really sort of intriguing, let's say. So I think just is the right word, but I would say prepare for more.
I think it's an important question from a public engagement point of view as well, because Corinne's using very diplomatic language about 1.5 degrees. The IPCC does say we're going to cross it in Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that means, especially perhaps some of Heike's people that she works with in poorer countries and much more vulnerable and risk countries, as well as the North Norfolk coast, which is falling into the sea because of sea level rise and coastal erosion. So there actually needs to be also, in addition to sort of the mitigation conversation, very serious conversations, important conversations about adaptation to climate change, resilience to what's already happening, what's already in the system. Sea level rise is a good idea. Turn off all the carbon dioxide taps tomorrow and it will still rise for the next 1,000 years. So this is discourse that needs to happen to actually be resilient, or more resilient and more prepared. And actually just for good science communication and good public discourse, that this is the type of stuff that is happening and is going to happen, that it, in addition to the importance of trying to get emissions down as much as possible, all this is already locked into the system. And that's a conversation that really, really needs to happen. And I think, as Corinne was saying, and also Heike, you know, adaptation hasn't played out enough. Risk, resilience, it needs to much more than we have.
I can maybe just add a little bit from my own project that you mentioned about indigenous sustainable development. What we found in the last year and a half with the lockdowns in the countries of Bolivia, Uganda and Papua New Guinea where we work, is that actually there was a recognition on the part of these communities that they had a lot of resource, a lot of understanding of medicinal properties around them, realization how important their culture and tradition actually was to moving through a period that we've experienced. So they've all gone back to, rather than wanting to migrate out to the urban areas and having a good life, they've realized the value of the cohesiveness of the community with the traditional knowledge that exists there, a stronger kind of realization that language is really important to preserve for them, and knowing that their traditional foods, their traditional understanding of the way they interact with the natural environment is really vital. So that's been a very interesting finding that we've had, that through a global shock like this, communities realize how how rich they are when they reconnect to their traditions. So that's another way of adapting.
And that seems a really positive note. to end on. I'd just like to thank the panel again. I think two things that we definitely take home from tonight are that a hell of a lot is depending on COP27, and also that we should all now go home, as Corinne pointed out, and work out our family net zero approaches as well. So I'd like you to thank the panel again, and then perhaps join me for a glass of wine outside. Thank you.